As people, particularly as they get more senior and they get into legitimate positions of power, they think that is sufficient. And that is not sufficient. You still have to prove your value to the organization. You still have to earn the trust of your subordinates, but it is not sufficient. There's plenty of people that have had legitimate power positions and have not been successful.
Brett, first and foremost, thank you very much for taking time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to be here and to share some thoughts with us. Do you remember the first thought you had in your career about leadership? Like what it was, who you identified with as being a leader? You know, maybe it was formal training, maybe it was just sort of some informal recollection, but the first time you were like, wow,
that's a leader.
Yeah.
I spoke at my son's pilot training graduation. I told this story. I said, remember, there's certain things that are kind of seared in your memory as you go through your life. And I remember it was at Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix, Arizona. I had gone through all my training. I'd gotten to my first operational squadron, and now we were off on our first training deployment because we were assigned in Florida, and now we were in Phoenix, Arizona, flying a combat training mission. And it was one of those very clear mornings just after sunrise, and I'm taken off on the wing of our squadron commander, a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Joe Gorecki, GORK, Vietnam fighter pilot, all those sorts of things. You know, and we're taking off, and I can still remember that, how excited I was to be flying with the squadron commander. And he was the type of commander that everybody in the squadron wanted to fly with. And I assumed that was the norm. And what I found out as I went through my career is that there's no bad commanders. There's nobody that comes in thinking, I'm going to do whatever I can to make life miserable for the people in my squadron today. But commanders that really inspire you, that motivate you, commanders that you want to be on their wing, I've got some of those things that we've talked about. They've got that legitimate leadership aspect, but they also have that expertise that you want to learn from. And I think the term is referential, that when you kind of roll all of that together, and after our conversation earlier when we talked about that, I really started thinking about that, cliches are cliches because they're true, but the kind of people that, you'll fly through the gates of hell and do whatever they say needs to be done.
Yeah.
And so what I encourage those new lieutenants to do is that when they see that commander that's like that, is pay attention. Pay attention to what they do. Why is it that you're inspired by them? Why is it that you want to fly on their wing? Why is it that you want to be around them and learn from them? And I think that's really sticks in my mind as the first leader who I said, okay, I want to be like that. And there were several things I took away from that as I went through my career.
It's interesting you're mentioning some of those terms. I know we've chatted about them casually, but a lot of people think of leadership in the context of power. And our founder, Dr. Hersey, kind of defined leadership as an attempt to influence and power as influence potential. And there's really these three main subsets to power. And one is legitimacy. Right? It's like you're the commander, you're in charge, And the others are more on the personal power side of things. It's like, do I respect, you might be in charge, but do I respect your level of expertise? And again, we'll get back to your cyber command, because while in the context of your service to the country, your ability to fly an F-15, might have distinguished you, when all of a sudden you're, kind of get a lateral promotion, if you will, and you're in charge of cybersecurity, right. Why this guy? So the whole idea of expertise. And then the other kind of the T word thing, the whole trust aspect, the referent power thing, right. Do I want to be like this person or aspire to be something like them? Those are kind of three key components to things. I think the other thing you mentioned that's really important is most people in leadership positions, they don't set out to screw things up, right? They don't send out to like, kind of disturb engagement or these other things. They have the best of intents. But what common mistakes from your career, did you see people in positions of leadership making that really were correctable mistakes? So things, they were promoted into a position of legitimacy, let's say, and their command or their tenure didn't go as well as it could have because they did what?
I think there's a couple of trends. I think that it's kind of a joke, but it's kind of true, is that people get to a certain position, like they send you to a class when you first get promoted to general, and one of the first things they tell you is that, hey Sam, congratulations, you're now a general. You are no better looking and no funnier than you were before, okay? So just remember that. So I think as people, particularly as they get more senior and they get into these legitimate positions of power, that they think that is sufficient. And that is not sufficient. You still have to prove your value to the organization. You still have to earn the trust of your subordinates. And particularly as you get more senior, you have to understand that, I saw this in the wing I commanded. I was a 1-star general. I had 5 subordinate colonels that worked for me. Now they all had to do what I said, but how they did that and how they pursued those goals was going to be based a lot on the relationship I could develop with them, the trust that we could have. And so while there is kind of that hierarchical leadership, I think you're really effective if, one of the terms I've heard is called peer leadership, if you will, where we're working side by side to try to get to the same goal. And you saw that very much if you work in the Pentagon. You know, in the Pentagon, I was a 2-star general working over here. I had no direct influence over these other 3 or 4 2 or 3-star generals, no legitimate power, if you will, over them. But I absolutely had to be able to work with them and convince them and persuade them that we had common objectives, common goals, and those sorts of things. So I think one aspect of it is certainly realizing that legitimate power is not sufficient. I think a couple other ones that stick out frequently to me is, I usually phrase it as, what I said is not nearly as important as what you heard. And so the ability to really fight for feedback, right? Particularly when you get to a large organization. You know, some studies say that really you can only directly influence 6, 7, or 8 subordinates, right? In fact, I got this question. I had the opportunity, we were talking earlier about, I was out at Duke's Fuqua School of Business a couple of weeks ago talking leadership. One of the questions was, you can only influence 7 or 8 people. How do you run an organization of 9,000 people? And I said, well, a lot of it's about communication, and a lot of it is realizing that what you said is not as important as what they heard. And so you really have to work to get down in those layers of the organization and walk around and spot check and say, hey, how are things going? You know, you don't go ask them, hey, did you hear what I said last week in our commander's call? What you have to do is talk to them about their job, talk to them about how things are going, talk to them about, do you feel comfortable that you have the resources you need, all of those sorts of things, and you'll start to get that feedback. Is my message getting out? Am I setting the organizational culture that I want in the organization? But you can't trust that just because you said it, that people necessarily believe it. And so communicating and then being able to demonstrate when you do hear something that says, you know, that is not what I intended and not what I wanted, making sure that you make a change, and it's a change that people see that, hey, the boss listens and the boss actually changes. And I think the third one, and this kind of lines up with some of the things Marshall Goldsmith has in his books, is the way I phrase it is never discount the possibility that somebody else has a good idea, right? And so when you're sitting at the head of the table, you know, and you've got 6 or 7 or 8 of your senior folks around there, and nobody's asking any questions, nobody's giving you any pushback, everybody's just kind of nodding north and south.
Yeah.
Something's probably not quite right with the environment that you have set. And so it's really important, I think. So I think those 3 things is legitimate power, is particularly in the military, that's where you start with, but it is not sufficient. There's plenty of people that have had legitimate power positions and have not been successful. And I think that communication and building that trust, and then I think listening, right? That other people have good ideas. And you know, one of the things I think about is, you know, if we've got an objective that I want you to get to, if I tell you, Sam, here's what I want you to do. We're going to this objective. I want you to do A, I want you to do B, I want you to do C, I want you to do D. And that's not really how you see getting to the objective. And so what I want to do is I want to hear how you want to get to the objective. And maybe you want to do X, Y, and Z to get to the objective. Maybe I think, you know, if I did A, B, and C, and D myself, I would probably get us there, but this is Sam's job.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to be better off by letting Sam take the road he wants to go. Because if he tries to do it my way, he doesn't own it. He's probably not going to do it quite as well, and we may get an 80% solution.
Yeah.
Or if I let Sam do it his way, As long as it's clear that he has my vision, he understands the objective, he understands where I want to go, he's got the competency, right? He's got my support, and we'll probably get a 95% solution at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So I think those are some of the things that stand out to me.
Yeah, so many things to follow up on there. I hope they don't come out jumbled, but the first thing, and one of the most recent things you mentioned, is you know, kind of like Marshall's work, and I think, you know, both his books, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, and also Triggers, are two of the best
Right.
I've ever read. But the whole premise of What Got You Here Won't Get You There is just that.
Yep.
You know, there's so many people in leadership positions within organizations that sort of get to a certain level and they figure out, or they think the reason they got there is because they were the straw that stirred the drink. And to get from here to an executive capacity, it's really about engaging others, and you know, you agree on the what, but the how becomes much more, you know, less dictated by your own personal experience and more dictated by, you know, by their engagement. The other thing you were talking about with the Duke students that were questioning you, you can really only impact 7 or 8 people. I mean, I flash on a program that we have. It's been successful, you know, with us at the Center for Leadership Studies for literally decades. That Dr. Hersey used to use, you know, personally, was 12 O'Clock High, which I'm, you
Right.
know,
Yeah.
got to be familiar with, right?
Right.
You know, you were playing
Yeah.
the role of Gregory Peck in
Right.
real life. You know?
Yeah.
But the whole idea when he took over the 918th Bomb Group, he recognized that his message to the group was one thing, and that was really pretty structured. But his message with Jesse Bishop, who was one of the informal leaders of that 918th Bomb Group, you know, that was something different. And that if he could convince Bishop to sort of see his vision, Bishop would take care of it,
Right.
you know, with people that he didn't have direct access to. And that whole idea of leadership as kind of a game of chess versus checkers, I think really distinguishes people that might be really strong, you know, first level supervisors, you know, versus dealing through 2 or 3 layers to, you know, to get something done.
Yeah. Just as I've read more and more about situational leadership, by the way, when I first met you and I told my wife, Mary Ann, I said, so I met the guy, he's married to the daughter of Dr. Hersey. I said, situational leadership. She goes, yeah, I remember that. She said, because, you know, in the military, you know, at about the 3 or 4 year point, you go to something called Squadron Officer School, because it's the first formal leadership training you have, and situational leadership was one of the things we were talking about the other day. Oh, she goes, oh yeah, it's directing, it's coaching. So, I mean, this is stuck very clearly in her mind, and I won't say exactly how many years it was since she was a captain, but it's been a couple of decades. And so I was going to mention that to you, that that immediately came to her mind. But as you think about you know, the different situations and all of those sorts of things that go into the model, back to your point, loyalty is the one that I think is key to dealing with that situation that you highlighted from 12 O'Clock High. Because one of the things I think about is, I call it the beg forgiveness, don't ask permission. If I could sum up everything I think about leadership, it's in beg forgiveness, don't ask permission. It's, I want you to feel like that, look, you've got a lane in the road. The more senior you are, the fuzzier the sides of the lane are. Here's the objectives. Go figure out how to get there. And I think that's how most people want to work. Now, if you're in my office begging forgiveness 3 times a week, then maybe you need to ask permission a little bit more often. But I told those students that I had applied that from the first organization I commanded, about 350 people, all the way up through those, and then the big executive staff positions that I had. And I never got burned. But what has to make it work is kind of from the 12 O'Clock High example, there's a loyalty piece to this, and it's a 2-way loyalty piece. And one part of it is, if I'm going to empower you to do what needs to be done, operate in your lane, make decisions, do things, if you do make a decision that I don't agree with, unless it's unethical, immoral, or illegal, then I'm going to do everything I can not to change that decision, because I want everybody that works for you to see that Sam, hey, he's got delegated authority from the boss. He makes decisions, he gets things done, you know, and then we talk about it. So the next time the situation comes up, you know, or a similar situation, that you know we're going to have a discussion about it. But the other side of that is your loyalty to me, and I have to set an environment that makes it work in the way I'm about to describe, where I don't expect you, you know, especially when we're talking senior leaders, I don't expect you to just blindly go out and do what I want to do. Back to our earlier thing, if I'm not getting pushback and discussion in the right environment, then something's not right. But once we've all said, okay, the discussion's been had, this is the direction we're going, then I need you to go out and execute against that direction. And I've seen times in my career, and at first I corrected it too late, and later on I figured you can't let this fester. If I've got any kind of sense that what you're doing is walking out of the office and going, the boss has got another stupid idea, but here we go, right? I also don't expect you to walk out the office and go, hey, the boss has a brilliant idea, because your folks will know, but you can go out of the office going, here's what we're doing, team, here's where we're going, here's our objectives, here's how we're doing it, here's why we're doing it. But for you to be able to do that, I've got to create an environment where we can have a discussion and we can get to the point where you feel free to ask, okay, well, why are we doing that? I don't understand that, and we'll have enough of a discussion where you can see my logic. You don't necessarily agree with maybe this objective at this time, but you see enough of the logic where you can go, this is not the way I do it. But again, going back, Marshall's got so many good things, is who's the decision maker, right?
Yeah.
And so if I'm a smart decision maker, I'm gonna get all of these inputs, we're gonna have all of this discussion in the right room, and then once the decision's made, we're gonna execute. And then you've gotta decide, okay, it wasn't my decision, but I understand why we're doing it, and I can support this, and I will support it, and I'll go on and do it. But you can't agonize over the fact that you're not the decision maker.
I think sometimes one of the hardest things, most difficult things to do in leadership is it's easy to accept or to understand, but to really come to grips with the whole idea that leadership is this multi-directional thing, right? So certainly it applies from you as the boss, influencing people that report directly to you. There's certain orders you give that need to be obeyed, whether you're in private sector or you're an Air Force pilot, right? The whole idea when you're talking about your Pentagon experience, leadership is also influencing peers where you have no legitimate power. And a big part of it, it's also having the intestinal fortitude, the guts, whatever you want to call it, to effectively influence your boss, to challenge up, to say things. And I think it's very indicative of good leaders. It's like, if there really isn't disagreement, if you're not getting some sort of pushback, especially if you're making big decisions, if you're it's really your responsibility to stir that pot. But just to think that what you've got is 6, 7 heads nodding and you've come to the right decision, usually there's trouble, right around the corner there. But that's a difficult thing, to build in. In your experience, how comfortable are people challenging up? Because you have a tendency to think of, military organizations, wherever they happen to be, is, well, here's the order. My job is to follow the order, right? But how much constructive criticism or pushback did you experience in your military career versus, let's say with your civilian transition?
Yeah, I've seen the same dynamic in the private sector that I saw in the military, is that I think once you get above, I don't know, let's call it in the military, it'd be kind of that major, that 04 level, you've kind of come out of what we call the company grade, and you're in the field grade. What I've seen in the private sector is once you become really that, first time you're a manager, that you have to fight to make sure that people believe you when you say, hey, I want feedback. I want to know when you have a problem with what I'm doing, because our objective is not to make Brett or Sam successful. Our objective is to make the organization successful. One of my favorite Coach K quotes is, you got to play for the front of the jersey, not the name on the back of the jersey, right? And so people have to believe that. And I think that it doesn't matter private sector or military, that the more senior you get, the harder it is for you to get the pushback, because people are worried about their careers, they're worried about, how is this going to reflect on me, those sorts of things. And so it's up to you as the leader to create the environment, especially with those 6 or 7 that you do influence, because the bigger your organization is, the more critical they are, because they influence the next 6 or 7. If you don't have alignment down there, then you're going to have some serious problems. And so we've got to have an environment where we can do that. So you really have to fight for that feedback, and you've really got to create that environment to make sure that loyalty goes both directions.
It's reciprocal.
Exactly. Yeah. But you can kill it, right, in a second. And so I would look for opportunities I'd be sitting at the table and say, hey, we're going to do this, and here's the direction I want to go after looking at this, blah, blah, blah. And I would look for opportunities if somebody came up with and said, hey, boss, I think, da, 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 da. If I could use that person's method of doing something, or if I could say, actually that is a much better idea, we're going to do it that way. I know it's going to give me the objective the same way, but that starts to create that environment where, hey, the boss does want to hear the truth, and they do want to hear, other options for doing that.
Yeah.
The other piece that I learned really not till I got to the Pentagon, it kind of goes back to a previous thing we were talking about, is I showed up at the Pentagon as a 2-star general, is that I found out there were a lot of decisions made by 4-star generals that never got carried out, right? There's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of things in there that are going on that just because the 4-star said it, not all of that stuff happened. And you just have to realize that that's what the situation is. And if it didn't happen, it's probably because, maybe it wasn't a good idea, or maybe, or there could be just evil people in there that are trying to block it, but not everything they said happened. And so one of the things that, a lesson I learned early on, it's another one of these, one was more fun about flying, but here's another one. I remember one of the jobs I had in the Pentagon was Air Force readiness. So we had to report, are we ready to do our combat mission? Are we ready to do these things? And when I first got into that job, I'm looking at the data, I'm looking at things here, and I'm going, this is very thin. We do not have a good cause and effect relationship, which is really dangerous because you're putting a lot of money into this pot thinking it'll produce this result. And the data wasn't there to say, hey, we're putting the right money in the right. What we're doing is we were measuring stuff that's easy to measure. We weren't making sure that linkage was connected. So I went to give a readiness briefing to the 4-star Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force, so 2 most senior people in the Air Force. And I basically went through our reporting system, and not quite this bluntly, but I said, we are completely screwed up. Our logic doesn't match here. We don't have a good idea on where the money's going. Are we measuring the right things, right? Because if you don't measure the right thing, you could turn the dot green, but not achieve your objective. And I got done with that, and the Chief of Staff, who's one of my mentors still today, he said, E.T., that was my call sign. And as a fighter pilot, there are many people who didn't know your real first name. And he goes, E.T., I don't think we need a lecture on how the readiness system works and blah, blah, blah. So basically, bam, right? And so I thought, geez, But then I learned that every good idea has a gestation period. And so you've got to let it fester. And no kidding, about 6 months later, my boss, who was a 3-star, came into me and goes, E.T., I just came out of this meeting and the secretary said almost exactly what you said 6 months ago, right? And so your ability to convey these ideas in the right way up the chain, to accept the fact that they may not be greeted with great enthusiasm, but if your logic is sound and you continue to support that over time, that you will frequently see that it comes back out the other side.
Yeah.
And as long as we apply we all get more done if we don't worry about who gets the credit, then that can work.
That is a great soundbite. Any really strong idea, there is a gestation period, that it needs to go through, especially if what you're doing is introducing an idea that challenges the system, and to follow it would mean change. So there's that initial pushback, resistance, but by the same token, at the same time, there's also, maybe not outwardly, but inwardly, okay, I don't know that I want to buy into this 100% right now, but I'm going to put this in the incubator and kind of see what goes on with it for a while. Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you, on behalf of everybody at the Center for Leadership Studies.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Leadership is a passion of mine, and to be able to participate in something like this with somebody that's got your position in the field, in the industry, in the art is really a special opportunity.